We're going to do chapter 12, but we'll start with chapter 11, verse 19 this morning, because it belongs with chapter 12. And the temple of God which is in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple. And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder and an earthquake and a great hailstorm. The new end of the chart. We're back to the front of it. How many of you have your chart? Okay, there's one up here. Okay, in a way, we're back here. However, we're having to finish the very last of the end, and then we'll begin. Now, so what I want to do this morning to get into this, I found one man that had just a paragraph that kind of puts the two together. It gets us started on the second half of this. We have gone through time, and at chapter 11, verse 18, that's the end of time. And that's it. It's all over. And those that are going to be rewarded in heaven with God get that, and those that don't do so well and are going to be punished, they get theirs. Now, we come back, and with our chart, we had that was with the political part, and that was the top of the chart. They're not going to show that this morning, but the church as it was persecuted by and delivered from her enemy, political Rome. That was the top of the chart. We went through the end of time with that, and politics and political people and that kind of rule and so forth, what it did to the church. Wasn't always just Rome, but that's what's covered here, because that's what the people needed to know when the book of Revelation was written. Now we get to part 2 here on the bottom. You get just a bit here. Part 2. This is the church as persecuted by and delivered from, same thing so far, her enemy, papal Rome. The church has always had to confront and overcome and endure and get through religious persecution. It would seem to anyone who hadn't studied the Bible at all or had any clue about history, that would seem like, what? But the church is a political, a religious entity. Why would it be persecuted by religious entity? Well, there is the true church, and there's the church that fell and went away. The church that just gave the real church such problems. And this is papal Rome. We know them as Catholics. All right, to bring this to you. We are about to see what happens to the true church, which is depicted as a woman. She will be challenged by a false church, who is also called a harlot in chapter 17. She will survive the challenge, see the harlot judged in chapter 18, and in triumph be honored at the wedding feast as the bride of Christ in chapter 21. Within the temple is the Ark of the Covenant, a powerful symbol of God's faithfulness to his covenant people. This section of Revelation dealing with the church will show that God is faithful and that his church will be victorious and fully vindicated. Notice how verse 19 ends with 5 impressive signs from God. Flashes of lightning, loud noises, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. 5 is the number for the partial. It is half of 10, the number for fullness or much. We have just finished half of the picture with the fall of Rome and now enter the second half with the story of the church. The church will not fall, but will have complete victory. So, as we finish out the first half of this by looking at verse 19, if perhaps the man who broke the scriptures up into verses and chapters and so on, perhaps I wondered if he didn't have in mind this verse 19 as a buffer verse, to give us just a little bit of a shock absorber between the end of the world and we're going back to 96 AD. And perhaps that was what he had in mind. Anyway, it does kind of act that way. So we get into the things which shall be hereafter, and chapter 11, verse 19, I have 3 more things that I want to present to you with this buffer idea. And I'm doing all of this, giving it a little bit here for you, so we can get our heads around this, what we've done. We've gone through history, and okay, that's it. Now we've got to go all the way back with the church and go back to where the church was in 96 AD and start coming up again, only with a different thought in mind, and this that I'll present now does this. It says the first series of visions, chapters 4 through 11, show the judgments inflicted upon powers which persecuted or affected the church and its history. The second series, in part, goes over the same ground. Its purpose is to portray more fully the fortunes of the true church. That would be chapter 12 through the end of the Revelation. In the first 11 chapters, this is the second, the way that a commentary put it, and I thought it was good. In the first 11 chapters, the vantage point was the earth. The events of chapter 12 and following are seen from the viewpoint of heaven. And then this one. Act 2 is about to begin. The scene changes from what happened to the persecuting empire with its complete collapse and fall to what happened to the church. The signal for this change is in the term, the temple of God. We have to, at this point in time, I don't know that you don't have this in your head and real good, but if there's any way I can make it more certain, can you just possibly imagine in the mind of God the importance of his church? There just wasn't anything more important. How many of you are parents? How many of you would give your only begotten child to be crucified, cruelly, spit on, tore up, murdered, for a cause? I don't care what the cause. I couldn't do it. The church is that important to God. Now, this is what Revelation is about. The church. The church as it was mistreated by the politicians. And then the church, as it's mistreated, has to endure the church that went away from God and then claimed to be the church. Okay. I hope I've made my point. The value of the church in the eyes of God. And just one more thing about that. Remember, please remember, you're the church. You mean that much. So when we get through with all of this, remember all that has happened politically, religiously, you're the church. And God has brought it, the church, through all of this. You're the church. The church is here because of God's continued covenant that he made. All right. We go into this of the chart, and we start with this first slanted piece here. I'll read it to you. It says, the church, pictured as a woman, was persecuted by pagan Rome, represented as a 10-horned dragon. As this dragon attempted to devour, the churches increased, symbolized as the man-child. And this is the 19th verse we just read, but chapter 12 through verse 6. Verse 1, beginning. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and drew them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. If you hadn't read Revelation before, if you had no background in this, what would you think? I remember the first time I read it. I read it again. Somewhere I missed something. No, I missed everything. Because I didn't know. Once you get into history a bit and see what's there, this is not just something where we have a woman who's going to have a baby, and a terrible, terrible. You know, in the Garden of Eden, we had a woman, and she had to contend with a snake. Now we've got a woman, and she's got to deal with a snake on steroids. Yeah, a dragon, red dragon. Whoa, this is symbolism. All right. There was this door opened in heaven. In chapter 4, verse 1. That's after we got through the introduction of the book, the letters to the 7 churches of Asia, and then chapter 4 begins proper what God has to say, what Christ had to say to John concerning the church. So it was a door opened in heaven. John got a look. This was the secrets of heaven were being revealed. John had never had a look like this before, and there in chapter 4, verse 1, that happened. And this is the revelation of facts that were connected with God's temple. There was the throne room of God and some number of things that John could see. And this all had to do with the church, way back in chapter 4, verse 1. Then here we have visions that are related to the church's fortunes, things that were going to come, sorrows, traits, trials, the history of the church's heavenly destiny. That's what we're looking at now. So we had that door cracked open, in chapter 4, verse 1. And now in chapter 12, verse 1, we have, in verse 19, we have all these sounds and the peals of thunder, the earthquake, the great hailstorm. I mean, things were going on. And if John's attention had ever strayed, even a little bit, it's back. And it's full blown. And he is really wide-eyed and bushy-tailed looking at all of this. So all of these earthquakes, thunders, and all this stuff, these commotions, revelation is taking place. And John, by this time, would begin to realize, I'm looking at signs and symbols. What do they mean? What's going on here? So with this verse, the woman, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman, a wonderful woman, beautiful, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown with 12 stars. She's this woman, and this is the church. The church. And if you want a scripture for that, there are many, but I would give you Ephesians 5, 22, 23. We won't read it, but look it up. And there she's likened to a wife. And then the church, again, in Revelation, we get down to the end of the book, and chapter 21 and verse 2, the church is a beautiful, beautiful bride. But for here and now, the woman clothed as she is with the sun, the light of the New Testament, and on under her feet the moon, the lesser light of the Old Testament, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. I've read different thoughts on that. Myself, I've always thought it was the 12 apostles, and always continues, the 12 apostles. Some have said, well, it also includes the 12 prophets. Well, I tried to count 12 prophets, there's more. But that's fine. Great. Well, maybe they're just 12 in the New Testament. Well, I don't know. So I settled on the 12 apostles, because they're talked about in heaven too. So, all right. Then we get to verse 2, and she was with child. Now, I said that we have a beautiful woman, the wife, likened to a wife, and she's beautiful. And I'll tell you, now I mean this, I really mean this. When a woman is with child, that's about as pretty as she ever gets. That's right. She doesn't think so. I feel like a beach whale, you know, I get down, I can't get up. And she goes on. Ladies, that is a beautiful time. That's God's blessing you in such a way. So, she was with child. Now, he goes into some detail with this, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. The church is giving birth. Now, some have said this is Christ. No, as when he first came. No, No, he's already here. He started the church. He's the one who married the bride, the church. So that scenario doesn't quite fit. The church is to have an increase, and it talks about increase here after a bit. But the church is to have an increase. That increase is to put Christ in the hearts, lives of people, to cause them to be, as Christ told Nicodemus in John chapter 3, to be born again. In travail. Some people go through agony before they'll finally say, yes, I believe God is real. Jesus Christ is my Savior. Yeah. Travail. Other people wait until they're right. Yeah, they got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel, and then they give in. Some are so blessed to have become Christians early in life. Teenage, even a little before that. And how wondrous that is. They are so blessed. So we have, she was with child. She cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. So we have the church here, clothed as she is, beautiful, and she's doing this. She's giving birth to new Christians along the way. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. And the 7 heads, 10 horns, and the 7 diadems, that's not just to make it spooky. That's something that we can say, well, what is that? And we say, this, of course, this great red dragon, the part of red is a warning. It's cruel, bloody, it's danger. Stop signs aren't made in green. A red dragon. The 7 heads. Well, let's go just a little bit further here in Revelation to chapter 17. And in chapter 17, let's read verses 9 and 10. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman, and this is the harlot, on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. When he comes, he must remain a little while. And we'll get into that when we get down this far. For now, well, what are the 7 heads? It tells us the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And as we get along through Revelation, we're going to understand that the city of Rome was built on 7 mountains or hills, and she's described that way. So we're talking about the apostate church, Rome, that headquartered in Rome. All right, and the 10 horns. Well, the Roman Empire, remember, the Roman Empire was pretty well destroyed when we got through with it in chapter 11. But we've gone back to the beginning. And so we have the Roman Empire again. And this Roman Empire has 10 divisions or 10 areas. And well, back here in where we were in 17, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. They receive authority as kings with the beast for an hour. Okay, so we have the 10 heads, the 7 heads, and now 10 horns or divisions or areas of the Roman Empire. And they had the 10 horns are the 10 kings. And this is interesting. They've not yet received an empire or a kingdom. They were rulers, but they weren't kings yet. They would become kings later in history. But right here, right now, they're ruling, but they're not kings. And this will be shown some by the diadems. So we have 10 horns, 10 divisions or areas of the Roman Empire, and then the diadems or the crowns. There were 7 of them. As you look at this political, religio setup, there were 7 heads or forms of government throughout this Roman pagan religio thing. And they had a lot of power that they used and persecuted the church with. All right, so we have another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, 7 heads. Okay, we understand. 10 horns. And on the heads were 7 diadems. Diadems were used as, the forms. If you had a diadem, you had a certain way you had to follow to keep it, or that could be taken away from you by the central government. Now we get to verse 4. And his tail, this dragon's tail, swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, it might devour her child. A tail. If we went to Isaiah 9:15, we would understand that a false teacher is the tail. That's what it says. And so when we read here, his tail, the false teacher or teachings, swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven. When you go back and look at history and who were the people that we're looking at after, say, 100, from there to about 300. Who were they're called church fathers. Either historians, which were faithful people, or they were teachers that tried to keep things going and to cause the church to be cohesive and grow. Who were they? And we get Ignatius and Eusebius and Polycarp, and we get these names that they were stars. And because of the false teaching, 1/3 of them lost their faith and fell. And so when you read about these old people and when what they had to say, be careful. Make sure that they weren't a fallen star that succumbed to the tail that swept away by their false teaching 1/3 of the stars of heaven. And the dragon, okay, we know who the dragon is, stood before the woman who was about to give birth. When the church would convert someone, they were right there, ready to make them lose their faith, their salvation, their own concern about their soul, and to make them die spiritually, to eat them up. We can't imagine such a thing, that a woman giving birth to a child and that happened to it. Hey, what's happening in our country when a child doesn't even get a chance to be born? Does that fit in here anywhere? I mentioned to my wife the other day, some piece of news or whatever it was that talked about the abortionists and the Planned Parenthood people and the anti-Christian lawyers union were all having fits because there was a state now that did not have an abortion clinic. Ooh, my comment was, it's getting around to where if a soul is going to get to heaven, they better be aborted. But that's not the way to go. That's not from God. All right. Anyway, so in this, we have these false teachers. They've swept away a third, and there were, at this period of time, there's great persecution. There were many that were martyred, and especially in the western third of the empire, where it says a third of the stars, and that's the area. We talked about that way back when the persecution began from political Rome. Then a third of that part of the empire was taken out. So now we have a third of the stars of heaven thrown to earth. The dragon stood before the woman about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God, to his throne. This is the church victorious. Oh, it doesn't look like it. Yeah, it's the church victorious. Christ was brought to the people. She gave birth to a son, a male child, Christ, who was brought to the people. She didn't give him life. She didn't give him, and Mary didn't give Jesus life. That was the Holy Spirit. This Christ was taught and preached and spread throughout the world, and at this time, the church was victorious. This is before real persecutions started in with the church. That'll come in a couple of verses. But for now, Christ was brought to the people, and he would rule with iron. Revelation 2:27 says it earlier on. And he was caught up to the throne there to protect the saints and to carry out God's covenant with his covenant people. So the church is going to really need some high-priced, some high-powered help in the persecution that it's going to face. So Jesus Christ is on the throne of God doing it for us. And then things got hard for the church. Got real hard. Now, the church has always had a bit of trouble with political Rome before religious papal Rome started adding its part. When the apostate church began to form and get its way about it, the apostate church would always be trouble to the faithful church. They were at odds. Well, yeah, they were opposites. They were diametrically opposed to each other. But now, and we're going to start with verse 6 next Lord's Day, Lord willing. And verse 6 is going to tell us what happened and what the church, how the church responded to what happened, and how long it had to keep up that response. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention this morning.